Georgie, I know that your days at the American Foundation for the Blind were very actively involved with the retrolental fibroplasia generation. Could you tell us some things about your early experiences with families and with teachers and in your travels from state to state in terms of what this rather dramatic population meant?
It was the most interesting time. I would say the 9 years I was at the foundation were probably the most exciting years of my professional life. Not so much because of what I contributed or what I may have come to me, except I was at so many places where so many things were happening. I just happened to be the man at the right place at the right time, it seemed. Before I even went to work, I was called and said, "You've got to go a little early to work because we have to go to the White House Conference on Children and Youth." That was the most exciting thing I had wanted to do, this marvelous conference in Washington that met every 10 years, you know, and I could get in on the 1950 White House Conference and have people like the great Akeson and the great Allison Davis and all those people in the meetings, you know. So I was sprouting wings just for the people I knew before I ever went in the front door to go to work, you know. Then, almost immediately, I began to realize that we had so many letters that had to be answered from people all over the country. "My child is blind, what do we do now?" So we began to try to organize the best kinds of letters and so on, and Kay said, "You got to write something we can give to them." So I got a bunch of pictures together and a little story, and I wrote, "Is your child blind?" And that little thing hit the New York Times real soon, so then we had to hire an extra person at the switchboard to answer all those phone calls and letters. So all we did was to increase our requests, you know. But the saddest thing of all was that the parents we saw would come into New York because they had money. They had been all over their state in say, New Orleans, all over Louisiana, or big cities and so on. And they'd seen everybody, and they'd say, "Go to New York to the foundation," only to learn when they came to us that we didn't offer direct service. And we tried then to develop directories and find places where these people could work. So we had to find a way to say, how can we get moving on this program? And the first big conference I got involved with was because of you, Bert. You'd had that big national meeting on preschool blind child from which the book of proceedings came out. And I go out to Chicago University they did tell me I could travel any place I wanted to learn as much as I could, to be helpful. Working mostly with schools, I was suddenly into all kinds of research and everything that were affecting the very young child, the preschool child. So I go out to the Chicago University clinics. I'm making my way all out to California, where I came to see Dr. Lowenfeld and where I first met Florence Henderson here and so on. But when I get out there, they all begin to say, "When are they going to have another preschool conference?" Okay, I'd never run a preschool conference, but yeah, if that's what you want, I think that may be what we're supposed to do. So I go back and present this idea. Well, there's no question we should run another one. We decided to make it a sort of work session, and that was our first big arrangement, Phil, that we had that conference to plan. Well, very soon, a couple of years, these children began to grow up, and we began to get greatly involved with where were these children going to school. We had laws that said they couldn't go to school in Texas, for example, unless because they had a residential school, and the same thing in Connecticut. And we got busy and we developed the Pinebrook Report. We called in people. I felt it wasn't what I said or somebody else said at this point. We had a whale of a job to do. So the foundation was very helpful in saying, go out and find the people that you think are doing the most creative work and bring them in, and let's have our meetings here. So we did have some meetings at that point. And then we turned out the publications. They came in, a man who was president of a big factory in Connecticut came in, and I said, "Now don't be disappointed. I understand your legislation is coming up next week." And they had, Connecticut said you can't go to school here, you see. And he said, "Don't worry, we'll get it done." So they bought up like 50 copies of Pinebrook, and they took it for the courts, you know. Well, they did get their law changed, and this moving picture magnate down in Texas got his law changed. And I went through, even though I didn't live out here, with Berkeley parents when they wanted to set up their program in Berkeley, schools. And they didn't realize Dr. Lowenfeld that was fine if they wanted a program for their children, because he believed in the individual and the kind of education that was appropriate for him. So I was largely working with distraught parents, not in a direct service way, Phil, departments of education and hospitals and so on, where they were establishing schools. And I was trying to develop all kinds of directories where they could find the nearest help. And then we got involved in doing studies of school systems later, which was a very interesting kind of arrangement in which I could take Kay Gruber and other people of her staff that she would assign to me to go out and work with these people. But it seemed that everything we did and every publication we had just gave us that much more work, you know, and even the jet airplane came along about that time, and a week after the first book were flying out, I thought, goody, we won't have to travel so much now. Well, we just took on twice as much work, that was all. But it was all exciting, it really was. And I met these wonderful people here in California, and it's never been a miracle to me that at the right time, I was able to come out here and live and work in this program, because as I think of San Francisco State, there were programs, like Dr. Lowenfeld mentioned, where there were certain courses taught at Columbia by a professor they could bring from the outside. This is indeed the very first program in the United States that was established with a full-time professor, Florence Henderson, on a year-round program in which they used the schools for that which they were intended as laboratory, with Dr. Lowenfeld's school cooperating and the local schools around here cooperating. And I submit, as I look around today, Philip Hatlen, and I see other schools, I know of no place yet, even on the East Coast, where the variety and kind of laboratory that is available to the university exists anywhere as it does here. And I think that cultivating it is one of the great things that's added to the program tremendously through the years. And so with a program that had that kind of support, it's not any wonder that Florence Henderson and Robert Bowers and Sally Mango and all of these wonderful people have, and Phil Hatlen, of course, have come out of it. But those days were exciting, and I don't claim much credit for them. Things were just going, I was trying to hang on and move fast enough, really.
Phil, she forgot the most important. I consider it the most important anyway. Mobility. And that was mobility and orientation. I mean, she was the one who started it. She got the Orienters and from Hines Hospital to Denver. Wasn't that the first one you had?
Yes.
And that started the whole business throughout the United States. We didn't have a single Orienter or mobility man in the United States at that time for children. Mm-hmm. And now we have how many? How many do we have now?
That's very true. I think that Kay made all this possible. And I said, let me go see what they're doing first. I hadn't visited Hines, so we went out to Hines and we visited, and they were nice enough to work with me a little bit, so I got the feeling of what was happening, and we thought it couldn't be done in the summertime. So, okay, we'll go to Denver where it's nice, and Denver had the worst summer they'd ever had that summer. And then, okay, it'll be fine. Then we go to San Francisco, and that week they moved outside. Stan, those fine mobility instructors did. That's when we got one of those San Francisco hot times. So we decided you can teach it any place. You don't need to carry on this way. But it was exciting, the mobility program was, and it made it so easy for me when I came to San Francisco to go to Sacramento with Phil and Pete Wurzberger, and I left his name out of those celebrities, and I'm sorry, that came from this program. But we went, he and Phil and I went to the hearings when we wanted money to train mobility instructors in our schools to be there, just like the teachers. And they weren't going to do a thing for us at first. They said, go out and get yourself a demonstration project and show them, and that's what we did do. And then Pete went to that program, and we were the first state to get a large number of people in the schools teaching orientation and mobility. And I think that there's so much that's started here, and I just feel that with the new staff and all we have around, it's going to be exciting in the future, too.
You know, Phil, I used to talk to the orientation and mobility people at Hines, that's the hospital at which we had the blinded veterans. And the first group that came through of the men, I used to say to them, there will come a time when the public schools will want you. And they thought I was crazy. They thought I was absolutely insane. And then when I brought you that time, and you started it at Denver, now, we didn't have a single one in the public schools. Now we have over 600 certified orientation and mobility people. in the public schools.
It's interesting to me. From time to time I discuss the development of orientation and mobility services for visually handicapped children and adolescents, and mention to some of my colleagues who are experienced mobility instructors that it was through the efforts of Georgie Abel that this even came to pass. And that's a piece of history that's not well known.
Oh, I think it is.
And it,
She ought to have a medal.
It's because we had good mobility instructors we could call on. That was the reason.
We were discussing a little while ago, Nancy, some of the preschool services. The retrolental fibroplasia population provided us with opportunities to observe and work with infants and preschoolers in numbers that we had never before experienced and hopefully never will again. I'd like to talk a little bit about preschool services. Georgie has mentioned that you, Berthold, ran the first conference on services for preschool blind children in the United States.
When was that, Berthold?
1947.
47.
What was the
I
motivation
didn't
for
mention
that?
it.
Yeah.
Well, the foundation received so many letters from all over the country, and so many people were concerned by finding children prematurely born who became blind or who were blind. And it was still a medically unsolved problem. And the foundation, although it does not have direct services, is concerned with stimulating, or was always concerned with stimulating services. So they came all to my desk, and one day I said to Dr. Irwin, after I had talked with Gabriel Farrell of Perkins, who had the experience, that there ought to be some way in which we should at least get together the people who are concerned with it and try to develop some services for these children. So we started out thinking about this conference, and I was asked to arrange it. And Helen Keller, who was connected with the foundation, was extremely interested in this conference. She wanted it very badly to happen because her heart went out to these newly born children who were sightless. Well, then the conference was arranged, and instead of what we expected, we might have 50 people come, there were over 200 people who came from all parts of the country. But what we had at that time was practically no knowledge about what to do with blind babies. So we had to call on outside people. And we got Kate Wolf, who was with the, what was it, the Association for Childhood Education. And we got Gesell,
Loretta Bender.
and Loretta Bender. We got people from the outside who talked on the topics that we submitted to them, and they gave, and of course Gesell had already a good deal of experience, although it was only with one blind child, but it was very fundamental. And they gave us, in fact, the first orientation toward what we should do.
And when we had an institute in Oregon, we got Dr. Lowenfeld.
Yeah, but that was when after I came to Berkeley and to California, and in California I became concerned with blind preschool children because we had a law passed on the instigation of the National Federation of the Blind that of the California group, that the school must provide preschool services in Southern California, because in Northern California the Variety Club Blind Babies Foundation had already started. So we established services in Southern California, and this is where I gathered most of my knowledge about blind babies and preschool children, because I went along with the people who worked at that time, Elizabeth Baird, Marjorie Cutsforth primarily, and Nora Clancy, Dr. Clancy, and Douglas, Mrs. Douglas. They all were on the staff at that time. Not all at the same time.
How big was the most number of counselors that we ever had in Southern California?
You had
4.
I thought
We
you
had
five
7
at
at
one
Yeah, you
time.
had 7.
And
You
you
had
and
4.
4?
We had
so
4.
at that point
Was
we
at
had
one time,
11
yeah,
counselors.
yeah. And I went along with them, visited the children in their home, and that's the way I really became acquainted with the problem. And I noticed also, as Georgie has said, that there was practically no literature available, even at the time when I was already settled at the School for the Blind in California, in Berkeley. So this provided really the stimulus for me to write Our Blind Children.
But that's true with all states, the number of counselors.
Oh, no.
Sometimes they didn't have any.
Well,
They
it's
didn't
still
have
true.
many. Most of the states didn't
had
have
none.
anything.
I have
New York
news for
State
you,
had
Kay.
one. Remember that one person? that-
We're not that different today.
And as a result of that, this Our Blind Children was written. And if it's of any interest, I mean, I wrote the book and dictated into the typewriter, and the first draft was already the final draft. I mean, I had it ready. It had matured in me through my experience that I didn't have to write a second draft. I had to write one or the other page over again.
Probably
But
all
it
those
was-
letters you'd been
but-
writing at
yeah.
the foundation.
So that was the history. But the School for the Blind provided the services in Southern California. And at the same time, the Variety Club provided it in Northern California. So we had about 11 preschool workers.
Yeah, and you served on our board,
And I
so we
served
had a
on
good
the board.
continuity
We had very good continuity.
between both ends of the
Just as we had very good relationship first with Florence Henderson at the State College, San Francisco State College, and then with Georgie Lee Abel. In fact, when the first public school classes were opened here, they didn't have any Braille books. So we lent them the Braille books. They borrowed them from us, and we gave it to them so that they could supply them to the children.
Yes, I think one of the things, the real impact of the foundation, it seemed to me as I've seen those early days, there was literally nothing else. You know, the federal government was providing almost nothing. They had consultant in education, but you didn't get any leadership role out of them at all, and no money for scholarships or fellowships. So the foundation was providing money for fellowships for preschool workers and teachers, and they were developing literature, your proceedings, and later your book, and then our a work session of preschool blind children. And then as we moved up in school, the Pinebrook Report, which had I'm thinking of them as an impact, you see, more than I think there was a rate, but at that point, they really set the tone in many states that had nothing. Then as the itinerant program began to move and we began to see the direction, the itinerant teacher service moved on. And so the publications began to be something that people looked to at the foundation, and a pattern was really set at that particular point, I think, as we moved on.
Nancy wasn't really that bad in the early days. Work with preschool blind children, was it?
I can remember sitting in Dr. Momini, who was the ophthalmologist that was on our board at the same time that Dr. Lowenfeld was on our board, and who I think he's now the chief at Johns Hopkins. At the time, he and I were talking about what could be the reason for the RLF, and the current thinking at that moment was that perhaps it was the nursery lights. I mean, we really didn't know in the beginning.
Then they suspected food.
Right. Mother's nutrition.
That there was something special in the food that babies were getting at that time that caused the whole thing. So,
and so when we started the agency, it's interesting because I really had forgotten this, but we really did not have the answer to RLF. We only knew that we were getting more and more referrals. And the agency started with 6 babies. I was the only worker for all of Northern California. I should not complain today. And we had 6 children. And of course, children just began immediately to be referred, and we had to hire more workers, and we moved up to 7. And I think we really can call that an epidemic.
oh yes,
Of
yes.
blind. Oh, sure.
And it was an epidemic. We thought we were, sometime we thought we were flooded with blind babies, that it would have no end because there was no cause for it that was found until in 1954, 55, it became established more or less that oxygen
For the NINDB study.
was the most important.
But you were
factor.
asking me, what did we offer parents at that time? And we didn't have much to offer parents. We did, our loads weren't as heavy, and because we had more people working, and we were able to go more frequently. And I recently ran across an old progress report that indicated I had children. I saw certain children every week, certain children twice a week, and certain children once a month. But we were it, and the ladies in the southern part of the state and those of us in the northern part of the state worked very closely and sort of in gross ignorance. We all learned together. I think we learned more from parents, perhaps, than parents learned from us originally.
I feel, Nancy, that you people did more. I'm likely to grab everything we can for the teachers because that's where my prejudice goes, teachers in the schools. But I think the preschool workers did more than any of us to get out and go to the hospitals and the doctors and the social workers and the related professions that are so valuable for these parents and their children. I saw this everywhere. In Oregon with Molly Vlasnik. And at the foundation, the same thing. When we hired Pauline Moore, she not only put publications out at the foundation, but she put them in regular journals where the doctors and other people would read them. But she also went to the Academy of Ophthalmology and the Academy of Pediatrics and so on, and really got into the other professions. And I feel all over the country, this was one of the great things you people did, was to draw in those highly related professions that are so important to these children and their families.
Well, I
And
think
they also opened up the placement of young blind children in nursery
Yes,
schools
that's what I
and
was
kindergarten.
Absolutely, yeah.
I was going to say, it seemed to me we had a cadre of excellent nursery school teachers about that same time. I don't know, I wish I knew more about the historical development of early childhood courses. Certainly we had just had the influence of Gazelle, and we had nursery school teachers who were very interested in children and willing to take on the challenge of taking a blind child into their program. And we worked very closely with those teachers so that we had, mainstreamed
Polly
preschoolers.
Moore and those people really got in there and did a great job in this area. Roma Gans, all these great leaders. The youngsters went to the good nurseries, in California, Pacific Oaks Nursery, all these excellent nurseries. Those were good teachers who were willing to look at these youngsters and say, I don't know what I can give him, but they were experimental enough to try.
Yeah, but they needed the challenge
They needed to
that
have
was
that.
provided by the preschool
Exactly.
workers, and that will be to their
They wouldn't have
eternal
done it
credit,
without them,
that they challenge the nursery school teachers, the kindergarten teachers, to take on a blind child. There was often a good deal of resistance because the nursery school teacher and the kindergarten teacher had no experience with blind children. They said, what will we do?
Yes.
And this was where the preschool workers
That much
stayed.
I think you made a bigger impact than we did in kindergartens because they were thinking of reading readiness and stuff in the kindergartens. But I think in nursery schools, and Polly felt this all over the country, that it was the very best nurseries if we just had more people around to work. They really took those youngsters, and that meant an awful lot when it came time to move into kindergarten, because we got a little more rigid in schools.
Phil, I think we don't want to lose sight of the fact that this disease hit the other side of the tracks. Believe me, that is very important.
That's a good point.
Believe me, before that, these centers, these representatives, these heads of corporations who had blind children or had blind grandchildren, they didn't care two hoots about what happened to your blind child. But when it came to them, believe me, it hit the other side of the tracks. And boy, they were active in legislation in their respective states, and we could call on them for changes.
And that is responsible for the growth of public school clubs.
Yes.
That's right, that's right. And I think that's important to remember.
That's one
It
of the
is a
most
good point to
important
come back.
factors.
Yes,
They
one of
were
the most important
taxpayers,
factors that we
The
have.
pressure of the parents.
And they were taxpayers, they
Yes,
owned
sir.
good homes, and they said...
And they didn't want their children to go to the residential schools, and they didn't, they said, all right, the public schools won't take them, but we'll see to it that we have legislation.
Right.
And they'll take our children.
And they sent people to college and paid their
Yes,
tuition
sir.
and everything.
So
But it hit the other side of the tracks.
You're saying that the RLF population really perhaps was the first time that blindness hit families that were in the power
Structures.
structures.
Yes,
Could,
you bet they
could
did.
make changes.
And they could afford to have the children in incubators, and that's the reason we have that disease. Because the poor people, their babies died if they were premature. And these people had money, they could put them in the incubators, and they got all the oxygen, and
Of course,
they were
the poor
blind.
people also had incubators without oxygen, and
Yes.
their children lived down south. That was an interesting sideline, I understand.
You know, you mentioned the Pinebrook Report a couple of times. I think there are two publications that came from the American Foundation for the Blind that had, and continue to have, perhaps a profound effect on how programs are organized. I think concerning the education of blind children, which you, Georgie, edited.
Yeah, you were one of the
And the Pinebrook Report, which contains, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, the earliest definition, written definition of a resource program in an itinerant program. And they are still as valid today as when they were written, and people use those definitions even today. What comments do you have on those two publications there?
Well, I would say that sociologically, the Pinebrook Report had a whammo effect on the courts. You know, you have to have civil rights and affirmative action before you can have real sort of quasi-acceptance of people. And I think that getting these youngsters in schools was kind of almost like fighting for civil rights at that particular point. And I think that Pinebrook had that powerful effect. I think for administrators and all in that Pinebrook Report, they had a role to play in it. And that was very important. And the next thing we needed was, as a result of our meetings, some people gave some very, very excellent papers, and we just brought them together. And I think those were quoted and read by students. Dr. Lowenfeld, that was the first really good paper we had written on the residential school. Oh yes, we'd had Dr. Frampton's book on residential school, its history and function, as a book. But this was an article that set forth a concept of the residential school that we were proud to send out for people to read. And Clarice Manshart, I think, gave one of the most beautiful defenses of the local school program when she said in there, you know, we sometimes wondered what we were going to do with a child when he came to our program, but we never doubted for a minute his right to be there. And there were just so many marvelous things that have been written. And she made that speech in Oregon. And over a period of a year, I just began to pick out the best things we had and made a little anthology. But because there was so little literature around, it was the best and only way I could see that we could get more information out to people, you know. And everybody was so good to us, they'd be willing, you know, to submit their material, which was great.
But we didn't have any, we had very little research out of that period.
Oh, yes.
That, I think, is very bad. That's a tragedy. The only research that I know of is to Cutsworth's, but it was unfinished.
We were so busy developing programs.
That's right. But you had a population, you had a congenitally blind population, and nobody took advantage of it.
Yeah, but there was no money available either, no research money. The federal government, as you said before, Georgie, was practically, there was no federal money available as I remember it. And who would do the research? The universities were not interested.
No.
It was too small a group, they were not interested.
But they were a
And I think Phil is absolutely right that we were so busy trying to to make ends meet, to get out there to give some service. Another thing I was thinking of a day or so ago when I was talking with someone who was in our city on a visit, and we were talking about this, and she was talking about all the research she would love to get involved in. And I said, you have to remember that at this period, there was a feeling in which there were an awful lot of administrators, not just in our schools, in our field, but in general education. I went to about 3 conferences, I think, and they put that little poem in there. They were making fun of researchers, saying, ain't science grand, and all these kinds of things. So there was a climate against research in the general population at that point, too. You weren't turning the world around, maybe a little in reading and so on, but we always have reflected what went on out in the bigger world out there, and I think that was a part of it, too. But the tragedy is that we know so little about congenitally blind children, and that whole population was a gold mine for research. It
Well,
really
I
is.
have bad news for you and good news for you. We
What?
still have a congenital
You still have a
blind
congenital
population,
blind
and you all can get your money and start studying. Yeah, we still.
Well, a
But
few
what's-
studies
what's
came out.
closer?
It was not
RLS.
entirely without studies.
No, no.
Parmelee, Dr. Parmelee did
Yes.
a good deal, and others did it too. But
Which
it was
was-
only possible to do that when the universities and
Yeah.
colleges with their research departments stepped in, because the foundation never did actual research.
Do intensive
It was
research.
only stimulating research somewhere else.
That's right.
But, and there was not the money available, with the exception of a few things like the talking book study or the teacher's salary study, but studies did not come out of the
Yes.
foundation. What came out was
Sure.
books, pamphlets,
Mm-hmm.
publications that gave directions to activities more than anything
We
else.
were in a period of dissemination, we
Yeah,
really were.
It was a period of dissemination.
But
And
you know,
Dr.
Cutsworth had congenitally blind children separated from the congenitally visually impaired. Now he had a population that was a true population. But he applied for money at the foundation, and we didn't give it to him.
Yeah.
Well,
We
they've
didn't give
never
it to him.
given that much money
See?
for the kind of research that he would have.
But he had a pure population, totally blind, congenital, not mixed up at all.
Okay, we're going off camera at this point, and are all aware of many of the advances in technology and engineering that have taken place just recently that are either directly benefiting the blind now or have some potential for benefits for the blind. Electricity and other advances dating back to the time of the introduction of talking books have made a dramatic difference in the lives of blind people. I am wondering what some of you think about the more recent technological advances, the Opticon, the talking calculator, for example, computer-produced Braille, the Kurzweil reading machine. Anyone like to comment on what these may mean or are meaning now in terms of blindness?
I'd like to go a little further back because I think that so far as contributions of technology are concerned, the main contributions so far came from the field, from the general field in which things were developed for all people. And that concerns the talking book, because the phonograph was developed by Edison not for the blind, although he thought about the blind as being profited by them, but it was developed for the public in general. The telephone, the radio, television, all these things have brought an enormous change in the lives of the blind. When I think back of the time in 1922, when I began teaching blind children, every morning at 8:30 we assembled in the assembly hall, and each teacher took turn in reporting for 15 minutes the newspaper news. We had to do that, and it was considered a very progressive step at that time. Now, who would think of doing anything like that now? You just turn on the radio or television and you get the news. I mean, these are, and the telephone, and of course the changes in transportation, these were all the very important things. I think the next thing in importance is mobility instruction. I mean, that is, and I'm not now saying it is second or third, but I think it ranks with these things, mobility instruction for the blind, and that was developed only for the blind. But until very recently, technology itself has not contributed anything workable for the ordinary blind person. And we are now, I think, on the threshold of developing things that will are not yet, but will be of just as great importance to the blind as the past generally developed technical instrumentalities were. Well, this is my personal impression. I am interested in knowing what you think.
I would like to say that being in education, my bent on this is the application of technology. I had a marvelous time when I was at the foundation sitting in with those people when they were developing these nice little black boxes that were going to be tape recorders and what have you, and hearing the engineers when they were talking about the Braille typewriters and all those different things that they were doing. And my interest has continued in that, and I won't tell you how many years ago I wrote an article called "The Talking Book is a Teaching Aid," and I talked about how we used it in the teaching of Shakespeare, because Shakespeare was, after all, to be heard and not read, and how when they first put the Shakespearean plays out, it made a great difference in teaching English to children. More recently, since I am not working full-time by any means, just doing certain consultancies, the one thing I didn't say no to was the Sensory Aids Foundation. And I'm just as excited about the application of technology to the employment potential of blind persons. And I think the last 3 years, I've been very excited since we have had some research projects, which by finding the blind person who wants to go to work, but for certain kinds of technology, he could compete with the sighted. And I think the records over this time, we recently have had a report on this, they've even added up what the rehabilitation money those people were getting before they were working and what their salaries are now, and it's rather amazing over a period of 3 years only. The application of technology, what we are able to do is to buy engineering of the kind of device that would help a person do a certain kind of job. And it's been a great deal of interest, and I think any of you who want to read some of those bulletins that do come out giving the reports on this would be interested. It seems to me we just have to have much more of this. And then I'm reminded of Johnny Dupress's comments, Miss Gruber, when he used to say, give a little blind child a tape recorder. When he's tiny, a little tiny radio, anything that he can operate and get himself an answer. And I think many times our teachers have been a little shy of technology, therefore this has kind of rubbed off on children in our teaching. So I would say my interest is the application at any level.
I agree with both of you very heartily about it coming from the general field and also the application. But I would like to say this, that we have had technology, but we haven't had real control of it over these years. We had up in MIT in the late 60s, we had the grade 2 Braille from print. Mary Switzer was there the day that we turned it out. But the vested interests for the blind did not change their machinery to keep up with it. And so it lapsed.
Well,
and
they
now,
did not accept it.
No, it's not accepted.
And they had too much invested
That's
in
right.
their old stuff.
That's right.
To accept the
Yes,
new.
and the blind people can wait.
Yeah.
They can wait for a generation or 2 generations. They've always waited. The blind people have. But I must say...
At least that's what they thought.
Yes.
Until the National Federation came along.
But the Kurzweil machine, the last bulletin, they said they had print to grade 2 Braille. Well, we've had that since the late 1960s, but nobody paid any attention to it. And I would like to say we have to control it.
Of course, I think the same thing exists. We've known for years that there's a better typewriter on the market.
That's right.
But they refuse to have a better typewriter because all this humanity they hire, would have to learn a whole new system of typing.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, again, we're reflected in what goes on elsewhere, too. But it's costly for the blind person not to have something that would function for him.
It is costly, and the machines about which we read a great deal by premature publicity, like the Akeson, the Kurzweil reading machine. I mean, they are. I mean, it's on the way, and I have no question that at one time or the other we will come to a breakthrough along the lines of either Kurzweil or the Akeson. But it is not, as UK said, it is not really controlled, and
That's
somebody
right.
ought to control it in such a way that they will know where the money goes, where the millions of dollars go that are invested in it. But unless we do it, and do it on these things in an experimental way, we will be left behind by technology that will just not do anything for the blind. So I think I don't want to be critical of the millions of dollars spent, because I think they ought to be spent.
Sure,
they ought to
Because
be.
unless they
More.
are spent,
One good
we are
battleship would do
we
all
are
of
going to be left out in the dark.
Entirely.
Yeah.
We'll have to use obsolete technology.
Sure,
We'll have
sure.
We've been using it.
So it should be, money should be spent, and even if the Kurzweil and even if the Opticon is not the ultimate thing, they will be steps to something that will prove to be the really perfect aid that blind people need in order to be able to read print direct.
And now Kurzweil presented his machine to the Blinded Veterans Association 5 years ago at Denver.
Yeah.
And they, the blinded veterans, you know, they heard it, and they listened to it, and they said, well, you bring us a machine next year that
Yeah.
will be better. And last year, they heard it. They heard the Kurzweil machine, and they said, let's get the Veterans Administration to buy one for each center, one for Hines, one for the Palo Alto, and one for Hartford. And we'll test them. But they're not in their perfection at the present time. They're just testing them. And I think it's wrong. It's wrong to say that blind people can use them. There's so much more has to be done.
We've never field tested things sufficiently.
No, I don't think, I think you're right.
Nancy, anything to say on
Well, I would say the same thing applies to my field of preschool, although it doesn't get into reading machines. But the research is being done with spatial sensors, and we see premature dissemination of the information based on experimentation with one child. And then we never get to see any follow-up. And parents become very excited when they see something in one of the national news magazines purporting that it's a very successful approach for early intervention. Yet I really would like to see the experimentation done, and done under careful scrutiny, so that we do know whether there's something we can be doing with newly blinded children in their preschool years. And if there is a spatial sensor that would help them organize space and help them with their development, then I think it's a shame that we're not able to take advantage of it and it's not made available. And I don't know, the money apparently is the big problem related to that kind of experimentation.
Yes.
Well, the thing that is really lacking is the timely, and I stress timely, input by the consumer.
That's right.
You know, before things are developed and not after they are developed.
I have a friend who suggests to me that most of the advances in technology have been spin-offs from engineering advances in technology applied for other uses. The Sonic Guide, for example, began as a device to find schools of fish.
Right.
The CCTV for low vision persons certainly didn't begin as a CCTV for low vision persons. Is there a need for some very careful analysis of the needs of certain visually handicapped persons, and then to move into technological and engineering?
And add your compressed speech.
You have to be careful. You have to be careful about that, because if you narrow it down to just the blind, if it's not a spin-off of regular technology, it's going to be a charitable thing, a charity thing instead of a
Well,
regular thing.
I would think bringing it a step further to say the combination of those who understand the needs and the technical know-how that exists among engineers. We've a few times have gotten these people together, and it's been productive. I think if you could have something of that sort, you probably would be better off. And your other classic example is the compressed speech came from helping the dental students, wasn't it? Study faster and so on.
I read just yesterday the new Federal Rehabilitation Law of 1978. And if you look at that, there is a great deal of money that will become available within the next few years that will really change.
It's amazing.
Yeah, that will really change the map on which the provisions for blind people are being worked out.
Do you know what that is the result of? That is the AFB and the Blinded Veterans and the Federation and the American Council. They all work together on that.
Yeah.
And that's one thing
And
that they got together on.
One of the few
Yes,
things
sir.
on which they got together.
That they did.
I have one more question regarding technology. Of course, there are two kinds of technology. There's hardware and there's software, and I know that Nancy has some opinions about some of the kits that are being developed for use with families of blind preschoolers. And to me, that represents a kind of software technology. And in 30 seconds or less, would you like to express some opinions?
Well, there is a great move toward intervention strategies that can be applied across the board to all children. And I, of course, become very uncomfortable anytime we try to work with children in a general sense. I think each child has to be considered and his particular needs have to be considered. And as we mainstream more and more of it, I'm just talking preschool, as we mainstream the preschool children into programs where there may be no one who is experienced or comfortable with that child's blindness, I think there's a great temptation to reach for a recipe and to take a kit of intervention strategies and quickly run him through to try to assess where he is developmentally without really giving a good comprehensive look to where he is with his family, where he is with his extended family, where he is with himself most of all. And I just don't like to see anyone rely on a package of skill inventories and their interventions as a way to working with children.
I agree.
still think
No
that-
kid is any better than the way it's used. Absolutely.
And you said it very well, and this is at the same time, this holds true for prescriptive teaching.
Yes.
And this is my great objection to prescriptive teaching, that it does away with individualizing and it does away with the teacher's initiative, with the teacher's creativity that needs to be brought into play for each individual child, rather than something is prescribed by a supposedly better knowing psychologist, master teacher, or whatever it is, and the teacher must follow that prescription. To me, this goes so against my grain, and maybe this is because I'm not exactly of the present generation.
Over here, wasn't it?
Do you hear that, the authors of Master Plan in California? I would like to ask each of you to comment now on some of the important changes that you've seen in your careers in work with the visually handicapped, and perhaps add a few comments about where you see us going in the future, hopefully. Georgie, would you like to?
I didn't get ready for that. Well, I think that the changes that excite me most are in the teachers themselves. When I went around the country years ago and I saw teachers just struggling and they had to just apply what they knew about all children to blind children, I see teachers now that ask questions and dare to experiment and realize that sometimes they may not be helping a child, but they're not going to hurt him if they're trying to do the thing that they see as the best for him and in that area. I think the teacher training is of a caliber now that teachers have less excuse to be failures than we did when I came along, because you're getting advantages of technology, you're getting so many advantages in this area. I just wish I could see a little more research. I think I'm seeing more interest in the part of research on the part of teachers. I happen to think technology, by the way, is one of the very good research tools if we just get it organized well and use it well, and I think the one we're using today is an excellent one. I have seen changes in legislation that I think go far to add to some of our conflicts and understandings, but also are going to make life much greater for all handicapped persons. As I mentioned earlier, I think the civil rights had to come, the affirmative action had to come, and now we're seeing the real difficult problems, which are interaction between the handicapped person and the non-handicapped person, between the different ethnic and racial people. But I feel hopeful about it. I feel very hopeful. I'm sure that we're going through a period of a great deal more aggression on the part of people who want, quotes, their rights. But I also still see that the blind persons that I have known who have a greater amount of security are less likely to be as forceful in just an outright aggressive coalition, but realizing if you're armed with facts, you might be able to get there with information that will get more happening. So I think we can face controversy. I think we can face many things. I think our attitudes toward different kinds of education have changed drastically, and that's about time, because we ought to focus less on programs and more on children.
Good, thank you. Nancy, how about you?
I think that many of the givens of my job have not really changed, in that a family that's confronted with an infant who is born blind or becomes blind is still a family in crisis, and a family with an emotional crush that they have to deal with. And that part has not changed in the 30-year span of my work with preschool blind and their children. But certainly, I mean, this is the era of the preschool child, and it's very exciting for someone like me who's been telling you all how exciting my job is all these years, to find the rest of the world now recognizes how important and how delightful preschoolers are and how important their needs are to us. Certainly we have much more material available to parents. There are many, many more. Even in the last 3 to 5 years, we have so many more books. We used to rely always on Dr. Lowenfeld's Our Blind Children. And now we have a library that we can share with parents of preschool blind children. We have school districts trying to meet the needs of preschool blind children. There is one thing that is happening with preschool blind that does concern me, and that is that very often parents and their children who are blind are being confronted with professionals who have no experience of blindness and who are uncomfortable with blindness. And from the infant intervention program, from month 1 until perhaps he is ready to go off with his VH teacher, it's very possible that he is being mainstreamed and involved in programs where he is the only blind child, and people really don't know what blind children are capable of, so that parents have to sometimes educate their infant worker, their public health nurse, their pediatrician, their ophthalmologist as to the strengths of their child. And I think that we still have this to go. We have not achieved this, but certainly we have seen tremendous changes in this 30-year span with the education of preschool blind children.
Okay.
Well, I would like to say that there have been some regressions. You know, I agree with all these people that say that there have been improvements and so forth. But I remember fragrance gardens, for instance. Now, we had those pretty well under control, but they got away from us. And now we have them all over. And also we had the museums for the blind. We've had that pretty well under control, too, because we had, you know, Beauty for the Blind and the Sighted. But that has gotten away from us. And now we have lots of museums for the blind, only for the blind. Now, I would like to say one of the things that I forgot to say, which is very important, we have visually impaired and totally blind. Well, when I started in, there was a prohibition against the use of sight. You couldn't, the children couldn't use their vision those days. Now, use it. If the ophthalmologist, use it all you can. Now, that's a lot of difference.
Yeah,
you know, prohibition against the use of sight. When I started in, gosh, I had kids who had vision difficulties. And they sat there, they couldn't read books or anything. Now you give them books to read, and if they can read print, well and good. You
That is a good point.
encourage it, but always under the control of an ophthalmologist. And another thing about education is that in the old days, ophthalmologists did the educational placement. And what did they know about it? Not a thing. The teacher should do the educational placement of a child, not the ophthalmologist. The teacher should go to the ophthalmologist and find out what is wrong with the child and how much vision he has. But she is the one, or he is the one, who places the child, not the ophthalmologist. Now, one more thing, then I'll go on to the next one. We haven't had enough consumer participation. The blind people have not involved themselves in inventions, in technological affairs, in anything. We have not asked the blind people what to do. Now we're coming to that. We're asking the blind people more and more what we should do next and where we should go from here. And I think in the future we're going to have more consumer participation than we have at the present time. We had very, very little in the days when I started in. So I'll go to Bird.
Well, I have a number of things, not too many though. First, I would say that I hope that in the future we will have more efforts and more research into prevention of blindness.
Yes.
Because the more is done in that field, the smaller the group will be that has to live under the condition of blindness, which, and let's not make a mistake, is a severe handicap. So my hope is that prevention will come to the point where most of the causes of blindness can be eliminated. My second point would be that I hope technology will produce things that are applicable in the life of the ordinary blind person. As much as I appreciate what Georgie has stressed, the increased placement and increased job opportunities that become available to blind people, and this is certainly one of the most important points. But what I like to see is something that can be put into the hands of the individual blind person, is not expensive, and will be supplied preferably to him at the cost at from public funds, so that nobody will have to put it at his disposal under the under charitable contribution.
Yes.
And when I sum it up, these hopes, I hope that blind people will continue on their path from separation to integration.
Yes.
I hope that the blind themselves will take part in this as much as they can, because they are the best sellers of their own needs. They know where the shoe pinches, and they know what needs to be done. And when Kay said consumer input, I want that in the broadest possible sense. Not only consumer input into means that are supplied to the blind, but also into the social web of our society.
Two-way communication.
And I know that progress in changing attitudes is slow, that it takes not only centuries but millennia practically to change basic attitudes. But I hope with Freud that the increased domestication of the human being and the internalization of aggressive drives will lead us to the point where we can accept every person as God has made him into our society as an equal member. And to this I'm looking forward.
You're here.
What better way to end?
Absolutely. Right.
Thank you. Cut.
Oh,